Good afternoon, everyone. Just a small correction to my colleague's presentation. I am, in fact, not Helga Drummond. She couldn't come. And we're very sorry. So you've got me instead. This presentation could, I think, be subtitled Things You Should Have Seen Coming, but Didn't. Like the non-arrival of Professor Drummond. What I want to talk about is why we experience something called predictable surprises, why we're never quite ready for the unexpected, why sometimes things happen to us and we look back and we say to ourselves, why didn't I see it all the time? Why didn't I expect this? Because it's perfectly clear in hindsight, yet it's invisible to us in foresight. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is why we think we can control chance. Now, I have a little invitation for you here. I have lottery tickets. Lucky, lucky, lotto. Eyes down, look in, lucky, lucky, lotto. Now, just a question, please. Who would you prefer to buy from? You can take one off the roll from the shopkeeper, or you can choose your own. What option do you prefer? Choose your own? Probably, wouldn't you? You'd probably really rather choose your own. Why? What actual probability does it make? What difference does it make to the probability of winning? Absolutely none. So why do we actually prefer to choose it ourselves? And why, when we choose it, do we expect to win? Because you'll see here, £100,000, prize up to £100,000. Well, you know as well as I do, if you're paying £1 for the ticket and some's going to Camelot and some's going to the government and there's 10 pence left for prizes, it's an awful lot of people. Well, where are you going to win 100,000? And yet, when you buy it in that expectation. Well, why does it matter anyway? Well, Barings Bank. Most of you in here are just old enough to remember the weekend that it collapsed. That actually was a predictable surprise. The warning signs had been there for weeks, but Barings missed them. The Nimrod disaster, when tragically 14 servicemen and women were killed when the plane caught fire in mid-air in Afghanistan. An entirely predictable surprise, a fault that was in the aircraft since it entered service in 1969. Yet in fact it had been certified safe just 2 years earlier. 9/11, the bits of the jigsaw were all there. Well, the starting point is that we are all, as human beings, overconfident. We all overestimate our ability to control chance. That is why we want to choose our own lottery ticket, because we really do think that it will make a difference to the probability of winning. We really do think that. And research into gambling behaviour has shown that players will actually bet more if they can deal the cards. Why? Because they feel in control. And when we feel in control, we feel comfortable about taking bigger and bigger risks. Now, you've all seen the cowboy films and the card sharpers where they let the victim win a few games before fleecing them. Again, research has shown that early wins in games of chance encourage players to bet more. It's this feeling of success, so they bet more even though the game may be purely random. And the trouble is, when we're overconfident, we are likely to take too big risks. Barings Bank, they were overconfident. They genuinely believed that a small merchant bank could take on the big investment houses and find niche markets that only Barings could exploit. It was complete delusion, but they genuinely believed it. Now, some of you will make up to-do lists, I imagine. How many of you ever get through half the tasks you put on your daily to-do list? One person. Most of us get through what? 3 or 4. And what do we do next day? We make up the list again. Again, it's our tendency as human beings to overestimate our capabilities. And one of the aspects of that is, and what makes it depressing working in a team, is that we tend to overvalue ourselves and undervalue other people. And a couple of Nobel Prize winners, Martin and McLeod, I think it was 1923, one said that the other had been more of a hindrance than a help, and the other didn't mention his partner in all the acceptance speeches. They were hardly on speaking terms. But again, it was each thought that they were the major contributor to the winning of the prize. The other thing we tend to do is blame failure, not on our own incompetence, our own poor judgment or whatever else, but we tend to blame it on other people or things beyond our control. Blame. It's all somebody else's fault. Now, these are just manifestations of our innate overconfidence as human beings. But it's a big building block in understanding why we're overtaken by predictable surprises. And I will be coming back to that theme as we move along. You've all heard the proverb, nothing succeeds like success. That's true, to a point, but only to a point. Because the trouble is, when we're repeatedly successful, it can lead to an illusion of invulnerability. If we experience repeated success, we expect to succeed. It never occurs to us that we could actually fail. Now, it can be in a very small decision, like we put our house on the market and we expect to sell it for the asking price or more. But it can be a big strategic decision as well, RBS. You'll all recall the disastrous acquisition of ABN AMRO. They didn't do that expecting to fail. They expected to succeed. It never occurred to them for 1 minute that the analysts who were saying they were overpaying for the acquisition were right. Never occurred to them. So not only do we expect to succeed, but another dynamic can be set in motion. And that is, if we're overconfident, sometimes we start to gradually abandon the things that made us successful in the first place. Now, again, it can be something as simple as baking a cake. You know, the first time we do it, we lay out all our ingredients, we've got the recipe book, we follow it carefully, we time it, etc. Again, it can be a big strategic decision like a takeover. You know, we do due diligence, we seek advice from people, we check it with this person, with that person. You remember the NASA shuttle disaster in 1987 when the rocket exploded on launch. That was a classic case of over-expectation of success. NASA had been consistently successful, and when they were planning the original moon landings, they used a very clear criterion. Prove to me that it is safe to launch the rocket. But over the years, as things went well and there never seemed to be any problems, they let that slip. And it became more like, show me it's not safe, which is a completely different magnitude of risk. And so, of course, They became much more gung-ho about the risks they took and launched a rocket with faulty rocket seals, with tragic results. But again, if we're repeatedly successful, we feel more comfortable about taking that bigger risk, because it went all right last time. Maybe perhaps if some of you are planning a trip away at Christmas, maybe you're going to go up to Scotland or down to Devon or something. You say, well, we won't leave as early this time. We were in plenty of time last time. It's that same syndrome working its way through, that we've been successful in the past, so we don't need to bother. We don't need to write a business plan this time. We won't bother having this risk underwritten. We won't bother consulting the accountants. And little by little, what happens is you come to rely increasingly on luck. And as you know, if you're relying on luck, sooner or later, you're in trouble. Now, it's an old ham, this, but I think it's worth stating. What are you most worried about? Being killed in a motor accident or in a plane accident? Most of us would get in our motor cars and never think about it. But when we're sitting on an aircraft, sometimes think, if this falls out of the sky. Now, of course, statistically, you're much safer in a plane. But, of course, what happens is we never hear much about car crashes, unless it's really, really horrendous, a big motorway pilot. We never hear about it. Whereas an airline crash, it's reported with pictures of charred fuselages, bits of wreckage. And that's what we call vividness. And a vividness effect is that things seem more closer, more real, more likely to happen than they really are. Now, you may have wondered what this happy pile of coins is doing down here. Right at the front, those of you who are at the back, I'm sorry you can't see this, there's a whole pile of coins on the chair. And those of you who go to fairgrounds, you've all seen them, those machines where you put your 10 pence in or your 2 pence piece and it pushes it along. You've all seen them? And it's tantalising, isn't it? There's a whole heap of coins right at the end and it just looks as if the next 10 pence will shove the whole lot over, doesn't it? And sometimes they put a watch on top of that as well. And it's there, and you put your 10 pence in and nothing happens, and you put another 10 pence in, and you keep putting 10 pences in, they're all going down the back of the machine. But still, that tantalising heap. And that's an example of a vividness effect. Fairground owners know what they're doing, because what they're trying to do is make the prize look so close, so achievable. National lottery adverts, it could be you. Well, it could be you, but if it's you, it won't be me. But they're trying to make it feel close and possible. Now, some of you in the room will be old enough like I am to remember Littlewoods pools. My dad doing them on a Saturday night, looking for the eternal 8 draws. And do you remember that on the pools coupon, they say something like, when you send it off, in the event of winning, do you want any publicity? Tick if you prefer no publicity. Why do they do that? Well, of course, they're not going to keep the cameras away from you. It's hardly in their interest. But the idea is to make it look as if next Saturday you might have photographers on your doorstep if you're not careful. Again, it's to encourage playing by making the win seem very, very close. Another example, we tend to notice bright colours. People in bright colours capture more attention than people in darker colours. Now, if you happen to be a buyer for a fashion house and you look into a crowd and you notice the reds and the yellows and the oranges and conclude that red, yellow and orange are coming into fashion, that could be a very expensive mistake. How many of you have been faced with an opportunity where your reaction has been, wow, grab it, just too good to lose? Well, you might be becoming the victim of a predictable surprise, because that is a form of vividness effect. And what it does is it detracts from thinking analytically and statistically. For example, be very brief here, a brewery some years ago, a small little brewery, were thinking about expanding. And they got the chance to buy a plant and machinery that would enable 8-fold expansion. One non-executive director resigned over the decision to buy the plant, and it was a disaster. Why was it a disaster? Well, the reaction was, wow, grab it. What an opportunity, 8-fold expansion. But suddenly you've got 8 times as much beer to sell. Who's going to buy it? And it's a perishable product. And also what they didn't realise was that the margins on large-scale production are apparently a lot thinner. And they went out of business. Because what looked like a golden opportunity, like the pile of coins, actually turned out to be a liability. We've all done it. As decision makers, we tend to pay more attention to information that we want to hear, whilst we tend to downplay or ignore the contradictory information. And because that happens unconsciously, we may form a very, very biased picture of things. So let me give you an example. I worked on a computer project a few years ago, and it was going badly. Everyone was complaining. But the reaction of the chief executive was not to say, right, we've got these complaints, let's analyse them, let's fix them. The attitude was, oh, they don't know what they're talking about, they're exaggerating, there's nothing wrong with it, basically. Teething troubles. Classic confirmation trap. And the other side of that is seizing on every little bit of what looks like good news. But we do it. Experience, a teacher with a diploma. Now, experience is very valuable. Let me be clear there. It's very important. And inexperienced decision makers can be a liability. But we can also be victims of our own experience. Because one of the traps we get into, apart from the success and confidence trap, is we start to think we've seen and heard it all before. So we may notice we may notice some differences between past and present, but miss them as well. Let me give you an example. If you go to the doctor with a sore throat, yes, open wide, yes, sore throat, go and take some aspirin, come back in a week if it's not any better, fine. But some serious diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever can look quite trivial early on. And if the doctor is just, the minute you get in the surgery, you all know what it's like, you've hardly sat down, the prescription's written and you're on your way out. And if the doctor's got a closed mind and is not looking for anything more serious, they won't see it. And that is one way in which they can miss the onset of a serious illness. They miss the subtle signs that are there amongst the more commonplace ones. Anchoring. Anybody in the room own an iPhone 6? Anybody lucky? Santa coming? Bring one maybe? One of the things you might have noticed was that the Samsung, the latest Samsung, and the Apple are almost the same price. In fact, I think the Samsung is about £20 more expensive. Now, you might expect that Samsung would want to compete on price. So why charge more? Well, what I think they may be trying to do is to what we call anchor the value of the phone in the minds of consumers. Now, you know, you've seen the advert for, is it Stella Artois lager? They used to call it reassuringly expensive. You put a high price on something and then subsequently reduce it, and the other party thinks, hey, wow, I've got a good deal. Because the irrelevant anchor, the initial price, is fixed in their minds. Those of you who've put house on the market, why you should use an ambitious guide price? Well, the answer is, again, you are anchoring the value of your property in the minds of the surveyors and the people who come to look at it. And even if your anchor is, as long as it's not too outrageous, it will fix an idea of value in people's minds, because we have this tendency as human beings to pay attention to irrelevant information. And even the surveyors, the cold-hearted surveyors, the biased surveyors, when they come to look at the property, they will deny it, but they are influenced by the guide price. And there has actually been research that's shown precisely that. But anchoring has one other effect, and you've heard the expression, why we never get a second chance to make a first impression. And it's very simple. The first impression you make on someone stays anchored in their minds. Now, they may adjust their opinion of you. If it's a good impression, it's not a problem. But if it's a bad impression and it's wrong, they may adjust it as time goes on, but they will never adjust it to the correct level. That's the point. Because that anchor is still in their minds. Again, you look at big projects like Crossrail and that cost a lot more sometimes than they were ever forecast. How do people get it wrong? They use irrelevant anchors. And as those estimates pass up the hierarchy, they get adjusted, but never enough, because people are still influenced by that irrelevant anchor they set on it. What does that say? Anybody read that as police notice? Could be, couldn't it, at a quick glance? The reason being, I put the police officer there, was of course that we tend to see as human beings what we expect to see. Now, you may have heard the expression that perception is reality, but expectations are reality too, and they can become a trap. I mean, just to give you another example, some of you done the tour around Whitechapel in London on the trail of the original Jack the Ripper? It is thought that they almost caught him, but that what he did was very clever. Instead of running away from the crowd, he turned round and ran back towards the pursuers. So, of course, the pursuers miss him because they're not expecting someone running towards them. They're expecting to see someone fleeing. Let me just come back to that one moment. And of course, it has happened in more modern times. We hear accounts of the security services looking fools because they go hunting for terrorists and discover they escaped the UK disguised as a woman. It's the oldest trick in the book, and yet sophisticated security services fall for it because they don't see, they only see what they expect to see. Tenerife air disaster. It was a few years ago now. 2 jumbo jets collided on a runway. Why did one plane take off into the path of another, killing incidentally over 500 people? Well, we'll never know for sure, but it was a misty day, planes were running late, and it's thought that the KLM crew, who were stressed and tired and anxious to get away, that when the control tower radioed, "Okay, stand by to take off," that the captain and the crew may have heard, "Okay, take off," because they were expecting to. And they radioed back, "Okay, taking off." And it's thought that the control tower may have heard, "Okay, we are at taking off position." And if you think about it, we all hear what we expect to hear. "How are you, dear, when you get home from work? Have you had a good day?" "Yes, dear." "Have you had a good day?" "Yes, dear." Nobody's listening. Nobody's listening. And you could say, "No, I've been sacked, I've been made redundant, etc." "Oh, that was nice, dear. What would you like for your tea?" Again, it's because nobody is actually listening. We're just hearing what we expect to hear. The recent Jimmy Savile scandal. An example, some of those claims may or may not be accurate, but they're not all made up, that's for certain. And the interesting thing about that was people did complain to the police years before the scandal broke, when Savile was still alive. And the reaction, every time they went to the police, victims, was, "Oh, Jim gets lots of those." So we won't do anything about it. It's always happening. It's called hiding in plain sight. At its most extreme, expectations explain why we are unable to believe things. Child abuse, Shipman, the doctor who murdered over at least 200 patients before he was finally caught, because we don't expect doctors to murder people. And although the climate is now very different, at that time, I think what may have happened when practices were signing umpteen death certificates for Dr. Shipman, that they were saying to themselves something like, "It can't be, therefore it isn't." And sometimes our reaction is, when we hear things that are just so incredible, that we just rationalise them out of existence. It can't be, we tell ourselves, so it isn't. There is another part to this. It's not all psychological. Some of it is rooted in logic, making logical, sensible, clear decisions that somehow turn out to be the very opposite of what we expect. More, as you know, of a good thing isn't always better. Yet we often think it is. Just to give you one example, what the monks doing there was that the monks practiced very, very sophisticated systems of organisation. Really sophisticated. They invented work study and organisation and management. But they got it to such a high degree because they wanted to maximise the time for prayer. And they were very successful. The trouble is they were a bit too successful for their own good, because they made themselves extremely wealthy because they were so efficient. And that wealth, of course, started to corrupt them. They got lazy, got more interested in wine, and that paved the way politically to justify the dissolution of orders. But it was this idea that, more of a good thing, more commitment, more job satisfaction. Yes. More success? Yes. Build on success? Yes. But only to a point. There is a tipping point where things can start to reverse on themselves. Virtuous circles can turn vicious. Vicious circles, the nice bit is, can be reversed and turn virtuous. One of the things we do, paradoxically, is we solve problems that don't exist. Just imagine for a moment two people frantically trying to steady an already steady boat. what's going to happen? Sure enough, they capsize it. And if they'd just left it alone, it would have been all right, because it wasn't unsteady, it wasn't going to tip over. Might have been bobbing gently on the ocean wave. But that kind of image is a good way of illustrating how the solution to something can become the problem. Peter Senge put it very elegantly when he said, you know, today's problem was yesterday's solution. And when you think of things like riots, sometimes police, they've learned now, but in history, some riots have been precipitated by, not by teenagers behaving badly so much as the police intervening, whereas if they just stood back and let the noise and clamour subside, it would have gone away. And that's another reason for predictable surprises. We overreact to problems that would be best left alone. Madness. The definition of madness is repeating the same ineffective actions and expecting different results. It was Napoleon who said that. Now, again, we've all done it, whether it's DIY, putting a bed together, or you keep applying for the same job and you keep being rejected, you keep asking the same person to marry you and they keep saying no. And what's the reaction to it when we fail? Often, having failed, we just go and apply more of the same and then wonder why it failed again. And that was perhaps even a worse failure than it was the first time. An interesting comparison is actually the history of the guilds. The mercers have survived. A great many did not. And one of the reasons was that when the factory system came into being, the guilds were implacably opposed to it. They did not want any of that. It was completely against everything they stood for. And when the captains of industry didn't take a great deal of notice, what did they do? They went and tightened their rules and they became even more restrictive. So in the end, the captains of industry just built their factories and recruited their labourers in areas where the guilds didn't have any control. Hence some of the new industrial towns that sprung up, partly to get away from the guilds. Now, if the guilds instead had just worked with them instead of against them, history might have been different. You all know the story of Icarus, who was equipped with a pair of wax wings. And Icarus discovered he could fly, and he flew higher and higher and higher, and it was wonderful. And then, of course, Icarus flew just a little bit too close to the sun, and his wax wings melted, sending him plunging to his death into the sea. Moral. It may be sometimes our strengths that actually become, in the end, our downfall. Now, just to give you one example there, HTC, a few years ago, they were the darling of the smartphone market. Could not do a thing wrong, and they famous Magic Labs and so forth. They're trailing behind now. Why? Well, one of the latest HTC phones is packed full of features, but nobody wants them. And I just wonder whether what's happened is a form of Icarus Paradox, that they have invention, they've just overdone it, invention for its own sake. Similarly, you see it with other firms that are prudent. They become overly cautious and don't take risks that on economic grounds they should take. Or adventurous firms just become a bit too adventurous and actually become reckless. And what I'm saying there is that it's just that they get past that tipping point where the strength suddenly becomes an almighty weakness. Well, okay, that gives you some idea, some feel for what can go wrong. But how do you get decisions more right than wrong? Now notice I didn't say get them right. You never get anything right. Because in an uncertain world, when you're dealing with risk uncertainty, it's never going to be right. There's always something you don't know. But the one thing you can do is try and get decisions a bit more right than wrong. Get real. Don't be overconfident. Formulate an idea of what you can achieve. Prioritise. Address the crocodile that's chewing the canoe. Never mind the ones upstream. They'll do later. Address immediate problems. Accept that you're not going to achieve all that you think you can achieve. And be realistic about what you can achieve. Be humble. Pride comes before a fall. Always, always, always. Think it possible that you might be mistaken. This is something my partner is always enjoining me to do. Just think it possible that you might be mistaken. And the time to really think those thoughts are when you are rock solid certain. For example, Porsche, you may remember a couple of years ago, tried to take over VW, a firm 80 times their size. And they nearly succeeded. But they came to grief because the whole deal rested on change of a local bylaw that would permit the ownership. And Porsche was certain, absolutely rock solid certain, that that bylaw would be changed. It wasn't. And it all fell apart. Assumptions. We make assumptions without realising it. Now, I put a sink there with water because every time you turn the tap, you expect water to flow, don't you? But it is an assumption. And I'm particularly sensitive to it because I live in a house with spring water. And sometimes you turn the tap, not often, but it waits till it's 5 in the morning and you're rushing to get out and nothing happens because the spring's had a fit of temperament. Another example of, again, how we make assumptions without realising it and are overconfident. A group of pensioners went to Blackpool for their holidays. And it was raining one day. And they thought, what shall we do? And they thought, there's a mystery trip there. Let's get on it and let's go off for the day. So they did. Where did the bus take them? Yep, you got it. Right back to where they lived. So they dashed in, checked the house was all right, and got back on the bus and went back to Blackpool. But the moral is, of course, it never crossed their frame of reference for one moment that that might happen. And most of us live within a frame of what psychologists call bounded awareness. Things we think about, things we take for granted, and we stay often within those boundaries. It's like hens grazing. They don't go that far. And in our thoughts and that, we don't always go that far. And to make our lives easier, we make these comforting assumptions. But the trouble is, it is an assumption. Keep your head. And use it. Now, that's a nice cure for vividness. How many of you will be going to the January sales, bargain, wow, look at this coat, it originally cost £500, it's down to £4.99, must have. Hang on a minute. First of all, you're responding to an anchoring effect. Secondly, it's a kind of vividness effect because of the price. And as you know, there was an expose on television about goods in sales and shops like TK Maxx and that some brand leaders like Jaeger and Austin Reed manufacture for discount houses. Have you got hold of the real thing? But another way of using your head and protecting yourself from vividness effects is to think analytically and statistically. Now, I don't want to turn you off here. Oh, some's hot. No. All I mean, for example, if you fancy a sports car, right, and manufacturers show you the image of the car going off into the sunset and it's all beautiful, yes. But what they don't want you to inspect are the emissions, so many miles to the gallon, it does 18 miles to the gallon, it's this tax band and that tax band. Now, I'm not saying, emphatically, I'm not saying don't take risks. I would not have said to the brewery, don't buy it. I would have said, stop and think about how this might play out. What might you be letting yourself in for? And if they'd done that, they might have said, well, let's expand gradually. Let's not try and do it all at once. Let's build up a customer base and let's phase into this plant. But it's because they were blinded that they didn't actually, they just tried to do it all at once. Some things, though, are better not done. Sometimes not doing things can win out in the end. How many of you have sent an email to somebody and wished you hadn't? As soon as you press send, that's it, isn't it? Not a good idea. How many have bought something on impulse? Wished you hadn't. How many in the work context have stood out for a higher price, or selling a house, stood out for a higher price, and the house is still for sale 3.5 years later? Remember, all these biases, overconfidence, expectations of success, add up in the end to predictable surprises. Now, I could use a vacuous term and say, expect the unexpected. How can you expect the unexpected? By definition, the unknown unknowns. Well, what makes life fascinating, as I said earlier on, is that there's always a surprise. There's always something that we couldn't anticipate. But what we can do, if a decision's important to us, is we can stand back and we can say, what have I not thought about? What am I taking for granted? For example, people who go to law. Now, was it Voltaire who said about going to law? He was only ever ruined twice, and it was when he went to law. The first time was when he lost. The second time was when he won. And the moral there is that to stop and think about what you may be getting into. People don't go to law expecting to lose. They're overconfident, your opponents are overconfident, you're probably overconfident. Where's the solution going to lie? Quite possibly somewhere in the middle. Anchors, what can you do about them? What if you make a bad impression? What can you do? Are you forever doomed? Well, possibly not. One of the things you can do is act in the opposite way the person perceives you. Do it deliberately. You can do things like the handwritten note, powerful gesture. You can ensure that if the beginning was bad, that the ending is really good. Simple example, suppose you have a business meeting and it's not gone very well. Not what was hoped for. Well, instead of walking out and showing the guest into the lift, thank you, very nice, yes, you know, we'll be hearing from you, etc., bye-bye, take them and walk them to their car. That gesture may be the one thing that they remember about that whole meeting. And it's cheap, isn't it? It's cheap. Okay, it's taking you another 5 minutes. But what value has it created? Or, and this is a bit more expensive, you can make some really extravagant gesture. So, for example, instead of having a teleconference with people in Hong Kong, or wherever, Malaysia, wherever it is, New York, Luton, doesn't matter. Instead of having a teleconference or corresponding by email, one day you get up and you go and see them. And again, that changes the other party's perception of you. You send out an enormous signal there. This is important. You matter. It is cost, but that cost is probably well worth it. I said nothing goes on getting better indefinitely. Now, if there's a Christmas tree, why? If things got better and better indefinitely, sooner or later, that tree would reach the sky. It doesn't, does it? Nothing goes on getting better. The good times never roll on indefinitely. So when is the best time to quit? When is the best time to change direction? Well, I suggest to you that it's about, well, first of all, it's well before you want to. When you're succeeding, when the business, I've seen this time and again with entrepreneurs, the most successful ones are those who do not exploit the business to the very end, because they're the ones who end up with the business winding down and sometimes worthless. The best ones are the ones who quit at 11:30 on the metaphorical clock. They leave the final stage of the development, let someone else have that. Don't wring the last penny out of it. And in the words of the late Joseph Kennedy, only a fool holds out for top dollar. That's worth remembering. That's well worth remembering. If you're thinking of selling shares, you're thinking of changing jobs or staying with the firm, just stop and think. Don't wring the last penny out of it. Again, the assumptions you're making that may prevent you from seeing a solution. Remember the drunk who looked for his car keys, not where he dropped them, but under the lamppost where the light happens to be good. Still looking. And again, sometimes we do things that are self-defeating. Solve the right problem. But just to end, coming back to that theme, to act or not to act, that is one of the most important decisions of all. Sometimes you really, as we mentioned a moment earlier, some actions like seeing the person to the car are really good actions that serve a purpose. Sometimes that email you wrote, feeling angry, make things worse. And it's a little lead into my January lecture, and I would love to see you all again, which is about the psychology of doing nothing. Thank you for listening.